Good morning. I'm Eric Brynjolfsson at Stanford, and welcome to this session of the American Economic Association focused on updating national economic statistics with real-time data. This is a session that's been organized by the American Economic Association Committee on Statistics, and we have four amazing speakers here, and then we're going to have a roundtable discussion, and looking forward to having everybody listening in participating. The speakers are Pat Bahari of Amazon, Mary Bowman of the Bureau of Economic Analysis, Ron Jarman of Census, and Fiona Gregg of JP Morgan Chase. And our first speaker is going to be Pat Bahari of Amazon. So Pat, please tell us what you're thinking about updating national economic statistics with real-time data, and you have about 15 minutes. Thanks.
Great. Part of what I'd like to talk about today is something economists normally don't think about, which is how you engineer such a system. And in watching both what happens in the corporate world, like I get to interview and see lots of different companies, how they use data, as well as within the agencies, you need to start with the engineering fundamentals, or these things don't work. As economists, we normally think of these from the scientific fundamentals, like what we want to do with the data, how we want to measure it, et cetera. But if you can't collect the data and you can't execute programs against it, it's a non-starter. So I want to give you a very, very simple sketch of how this type of system, one path for this type of system to work. Suppose you wanted to take the retail sales numbers produced by the US Census. And suppose you wanted to have those numbers on a daily basis with a latency of 1 day. And suppose you even wanted to have those numbers disaggregated down to the county level. So you could see how, let's say, the stimulus was impacting different geographies, different groups of people. It's not a hard tech problem. It's not a hard tech problem at all. Here's how this type of thing would look. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to exploit the fact that in almost every industry, the size distribution of firms follows a power law. For example, I looked at some data from the National Retail Federation, and the top 100 retailers cover about 2/3 of retail sales, roughly. That's equal to the current response rate, as I understand it, from the census, might even be a little better. Now think about each one of these companies has a data lake, and within that data lake, there's a notebook. By a notebook, think of the simplest version you might be used to is Instata, the thing you type in your commands on and then execute. So think of there being a notebook that runs a job against the data lake. Within each company, they say, sum up your total sales. That's not a trivial job, or that's a very, very trivial job. Or if you say, sum up your sales by some geographic entity like state or county, also not a very difficult job. Very small computation compared to what they're used to. So each one of these 100 entities takes that statistic. They then send that statistic to a very secure central server, okay? So you have the sales of 100 firms sitting on a highly secure point. That highly secure point sums them up and then sends them to Washington, D.C. As I said, this is not a hard job. And just think about what you could get with this type of stuff. I mean, first of all, you can see how, for one key statistic, how the economy is responding with a latency of 1 day. So you can see in real time the behavior of the economy. Second, suppose you took that data and you disaggregated down to the county and zip. You could take that and merge that with standard census data, and you could ask, well, how's the, let's say, stimulus package affecting people by different income deciles? In particular, I think you'd be worried about the lower deciles, who would be most vulnerable to variability in income. A third thing I'm going to say is, I'm not going to go deep here, but you can distinguish between the real and the nominal. Companies typically have something that looks like a P and a Q. And currently, there are a lot of assumptions that are baked into distinguishing between the real and the nominal, but you can see those things in a real-time basis. When you have an environment where there's potentially a lot of inflation going on and happening in different places, that could be extremely powerful. Another thing that's useful about this is your seasonal modeling gets much better. This is something we frequently forget about, but when you have things like Thanksgiving moves 10 days within a calendar year, your ability to kind of map out the calendar to control for seasonal effects at a daily basis gives you a much better measurement of seasonality. And if you get a better measurement of seasonality, you get trend. A final thing about this is, you really limit issues surrounding privacy and security. Companies do not like the thought of data, particularly about customers going off premise, because it could violate the trust of their customers and be a huge issue for them. But if what's going off premise is the sum of all of customers' behavior, that's less of an issue. In fact, when companies report retail sales in the current way, that's sort of what they do. So let me talk about some mistakes that you could make going down this path. And most of these mistakes are going to be around kind of engineering ABCs, because that's where I suspect a lot of these problems are going to break down. And by the way, I just gave you the example of retail sales. This type of logic could apply in many, many other places. The first is, you do not let scientists build software systems. A mistake I've seen over and over and over again is, hey, we're going to build a system to look at data at scale. Let's hire a data scientist or a data engineer. What will happen to those systems is, at some point, they'll break, because issues of scale and computational efficiency and security aren't at the forefront of their mind. The type of person you want to lead those, I think of like friends of mine who were technology VPs at Amazon or Facebook or somewhere like that, who were primarily software engineers, but their customers internally were scientists. They're going to build things that allow you to look at a whole variety of problems. They're going to be constantly thinking about how to improve the efficiency of those systems and keep costs down. To just give you a simple example, within a lot of the official stats, imputation is an important issue. I remember watching one of my software engineers, I have about 40 of them on my team, taking imputations inside of SAS, and he sped them up and we couldn't make a particular set of computations scale. He sped them up by a factor of 1,000. You just really need to know, you really need to have people who think about building robust systems that can solve many, 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 many problems. A second thing is, I think it's important to think of the data living on premise. And this is for a whole bunch of reasons. The first is, the upload speeds are just not fast enough to move petabytes of data between private companies and any sort of public entity. So I don't think it's a good idea for a lot of reasons, but even the tech in terms of the upload speeds, you're going to find that that is a bottleneck. I think you're going to get a lot of pushback from companies if you say, look, take data that could be potentially viewed as sensitive about customers at an individual level and put it somewhere else. Those are major reputational issues. The job of the agencies instead, I would think, would be to curate these notebooks. So within those companies, they might be able to go under an appropriate NDA and say, understand what the variables are that they look at and make sure that they, the things that they're summing up and reporting actually correspond to the definitions you want. And let me just tell you, within a typical data lake, there may be 20 different notions of sales. And somebody currently is summing those things up and reporting them. And I bet there's a fairly high defect rate in terms of what a scientist would like to do versus what is actually happening. I think another thing that needs to happen for this stuff to occur is there needs to be some form of legislation. Currently, if you were public spirited and wanted to share data with the BA, the BLS, the census, a problem you face is the ways in which I'm not a lawyer, but I've learned a little bit about this. Anti-corruption statutes are framed. So companies, let's say, maybe doing business with these entities. And if they're giving something to those entities for free, that's typically a problem. And there's a lot of legal work involved in just doing this type of sharing. There needs to be something, something more streamlined to do this. And the last thing I'm going to say is, I think if you're going to create this type of system, you're going to need to have kind of a parallel path as compared to the current CTOs of those organizations. Like the current CTOs, their number one job is to keep the current system running. And they may not be trained in how to think about having people who are using tools from data science, machine learning, and the mixture of those with the econometrics that you're going to need to do these at scale. So you're going to need to go and create a parallel path rather than put it into an organization where that's not part of the focus. So I'm just going to stop there, but these are things based on having made a lot of mistakes myself in trying to build systems of this ilk, and the people tend to have very naive mental models, like let's take all the data, port it to Washington, D.C., and then the agencies will just sit down and work with it. It doesn't work because of upload speeds. It doesn't work because of privacy. In fact, there are hundreds of people within these companies that curate those data lakes, and you're just going to be overwhelmed by that task. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Pat. That's a really exciting initiative, and it's a great way to start the session. I just want to remind everyone who's participating that you can also join into the discussion. Use the Q&A function. We're going to take all the questions at 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Pacific, and we'll have a general discussion. So please go ahead and use that Q&A function to put your questions in there. Next up will be Mary Bowman, the Acting Director of the Bureau of Economic Analysis. Mary, take it away.
Thanks, Eric. And I appreciate the opportunity to discuss BEA's innovations in the use of private sector data, including high frequency data. My colleagues, Abe Dunn, Anna Scorbe, Eric Stroessner, and Annabelle Girard contributed to my remarks. Today, I'll discuss BEA's longstanding use of private data, and that's evolved over time. I'll look at the role of high frequency and big data to provide more timely, accurate, and detailed statistics, and will provide examples, and then conclude with lessons learned in the form of opportunities and challenges. Oops, hold on. BEA has a long-standing use of private data. GDP that we measure provides a measure of a complex US economy of over $21 trillion. And in order to measure the different components from consumption to trade to investment and inventories, BEA draws from more than 300 data sources each month, mostly from government surveys, administrative records, and private companies. And we've long used private data sources, currently have about 140 different private vendor data sets, and this slide shows the highlights. Some of the data provide aggregate indicators, but increasingly BEA obtains and deploys newer types of data, including high frequency and large or big data. And to use this, data science plays an increasingly important role at the Bureau as we capitalize on the availability of these new data sources. Let me turn next to a few recent examples, and I'll start with using data science to improve the accuracy and timeliness of our statistics. And first, I'll look at how we've applied machine learning and alternative data to improve the accuracy of quarterly GDP estimates for services, a large and growing part of the US economy. At BEA, research began about 5 years ago to investigate whether maximum likelihood methods could improve short-term predictions for the service sector. And as shown on the slide, BEA produces the first or advanced estimate of quarterly GDP less than 30 days after the quarter ends. And to measure services, we don't get the Census Bureau's quarterly service survey, or QSS, until the following month. And so in order to prove upon the prediction that we were using for the advanced estimate, BEA staff developed a maximum likelihood model that draws on both traditional and alternative data. And the team that developed the model systematically assessed alternative maximum likelihood models and selected one that became part of the toolkit for how we produce our advanced GDP. And this was prior to COVID. And it led to improved accuracy of the service sector's numbers in the advanced estimate compared to the previous approach. And this was an important first step that really showed our staff in production the value of these new approaches. And I would note that to do this, Fiserv card transaction data is one of the alternative data sets. And that makes a nice segue to the next example, where BEA is using that Fiserv card transaction data to develop more timely, high-frequency statistics. And we were motivated to do this to be able to measure consumer spending during COVID. And in the previous example, we were using monthly data from Fiserv, but the contract that we had an option to obtain daily data. We were able to quickly exercise that option. And just to illustrate what we produce, this is the latest release at the end of December on spending on food services and drinking places. Let me just say a little more about what we did to produce these estimates. And I think that a key is that we built on expertise that we had built up through the previous project and other data science work, as well as an IT infrastructure that we had started putting in place for the research and deployment of the services sector model and these other data science projects. So within a month, BEA staff had published a working paper using an event study approach to estimate the effects of the pandemic. And that really added to the transparency of our using the data. just a few things that we'd also learned from earlier use, the data strengths and weaknesses, so we could anticipate which categories of Fiserv data would perform relatively well. We had also, we're part of the Economic Statistics Network, and we're very familiar with the Federal Reserve's use of Fiserv, and we adopted their event study model in this work. And we also were in close contact with Census that was also using the same data and shared experiences. So this was really rapid adoption because of the work we had already done. And we were able to use this to improve consumption measures in GDP and personal income statistics in time for the end of April advance estimates for the first quarter of 2020. And the data and the modeling were especially valuable to measure dramatic changes that took place mid-March. And then in June, we developed the process to be able to release regular updates to this data that was originally in the working paper, and have been doing that since then on approximately a bi-weekly basis. Let me just build on that in terms of what we've been learning, I think, because of the pandemic, is that we didn't just add Fiserv as another arrow to our quiver or tool to our toolbox. We looked at other high frequency data, and this slide gives an example. And a key here was, we have a staff at BEA of hundreds of economists with deep expertise in the different sectors. And they went out and looked for and tested the quality of alternative data sets. And, all of the ones here aren't record level data like Fiserv, but they provide new and reliable information that they were able to assess. And this focuses on the service sector and complemented the other information that we had. The pandemic's not over, but we have been thinking about lessons learned and how to continue to improve our measurement. And one is that, and this is a little obvious, but more good data is better. With our staff with expertise have been invaluable to find and assess for quality different sources. We've also found that having a portfolio, some high frequency, some more aggregated, some modeling, has been very valuable. The high frequency card transaction data performs better during COVID with large swings in consumption. However, the maximum likelihood modeled service estimates provided better information in a normal economy. And I'll just illustrate that with one chart that comes from a paper that Dunn, Hood, Dreesen, and Batch presented at last year's ASSA meetings. And they analyzed the performance of the Fiserv data in different circumstances, including analyzing correlations with Census's monthly retail trade survey, or MRTS. They also looked at QSS in their paper, and they compared pre and post pandemic, and post is during the pandemic. And this chart shows the correlations of select retail and food service categories between the Fiserv and MRTS data. And across all the products shown, higher correlations exist when there's bigger movements in the data during the pandemic, or in orange. And I think this is just an example of what we see as the need for a portfolio of data types to measure the economy under different circumstances. Let me conclude my examples and focus on how BEA is using high frequency private sector data to expand the detail in our statistics. And the first example is BEA's healthcare satellite account, which has the goal to improve understanding of healthcare spending in the US. We continue to produce GDP using traditional measures of individual goods and services, for example, prescription drugs or doctor's visits, but the healthcare satellite account provides a complementary and we think insightful measure with outputs defined as the treatment of a condition, for example, diabetes and the associated spending. And initially, and this work is quite longstanding, BEA used the Medical Expenditure Panel Survey to measure 18 broad categories of diseases. And the innovation with large, big, high-frequency data or big data is that we can bring in a lot more data. We use MarketScan and other sources, and MarketScan is a private data vendor, and we blended that in with the MEPS panel survey to expand our expand the sample, and this enabled the team that works on the healthcare satellite account to expand disease coverage to 261 detailed conditions. This also improved the quality of the estimates, again, by having more good data. And the second example is the recent release of expanded detail for state personal consumption expenditures, where the Pfizer table enabled BEA to report the additional detail that now measures what we provide in the national measures of quarterly and annual GDP. Let me conclude with some thoughts about opportunities and challenges that we've learned over the past 5+ years as we've brought data science into BEA, and how new, often high frequency big data sources can improve the quality, timeliness, and detail of our economic statistics. I think, key is we build on a long-standing expertise to acquire and assess the quality of data sources. And then we've been able to expand that with adopting data science methods and building staff expertise in working with this large, often high frequency data. And without a question, this creating a mass or scale of expertise within the Bureau is paying off and setting stage for the future. Now, it hasn't all been, I've talked a lot about the successes. There have been plenty of things we've tried that haven't worked. That's part of, I think, a early stage of innovation. And we've learned some lessons from both the successes and the dead ends. And I'll start with data quality, which is central to meeting our mission. And representative is important and always comes up as something important to consider with alternative sources, as they are typically not built from a statistically significant sample. Common issues include the coverage and composition of businesses and products. And we've developed BEA, and other places have done the same, strategies to benchmark to high quality representative sources, often data from census or BLS. We also have to be able to link the data to standard classification schemes, such as the NAICS codes. And statistical agency, as well as data vendors, have developed methods to do this. But it takes work, it takes time and money to do this. As statistical agencies, transparency is key so that our data users understand our methods and sources, have ongoing trust in what we do. And we've had to invest significant resources to assess and document the data, as private data was not originally created with this goal in mind. And now my final slide, just to continue this discussion of opportunities and challenges. There are costs to assess the quality, develop methods to improve representativeness, and we found it valuable to work with other federal agencies and academic researchers, and also with the private data vendors where we purchase data. And across the statistical system, this has really happened. Research has been published. We've had documentation. So I think we're building that expertise, but having collaboration and partnership is key. We have a new partnership with BEA, Census, and BLS to work with the Opportunity Insights Group from Harvard and Brown universities to investigate additional data sets and their potential for official statistics. And we've presented that initial work and where we're going at our Federal Economic Statistics Committee, or FESAC, meeting last June. And let me just conclude with two final points that are on the challenges category. One is availability, where we do have to identify vendors. We can do this. We've had success, but we've also had challenges with changes in vendors and availability in the work that we've done. And then cost, the cost of both data storage and purchases. And in a recent survey of statistical agencies by the Interagency Committee on Statistical Policy, the survey asked about the use of private sector data. The top obstacle was the combined cost of purchasing the data and associated computing power to analyze the data and storage costs. So thanks for the opportunity to share our experiences and the really great potential we see for the future.
Thanks so much, Mary. It's striking how much real-time data you're already using. So that's great to see. And I'll remind all the participants that you have a chance to ask Mary and Pat and all the other panelists questions. Use the Q&A function, and we'll have a general discussion starting in about 30 minutes. So next up, we have Ron Jarman. He is the Deputy Director of the Census Bureau and its Chief Operating Officer. Take it away, Ron.
Thanks, Eric. I've lost my. There we go.
I think you're not in presentation mode.
There's video.
No, we see your slide. Yep. There we go. Now it's in presentation mode.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. So thanks for this, and thanks for those like Eric and Pat and others who are up early in other parts of the country. It's great to be here. So I'm going to maybe almost combine how the approach that Pat and Mary took, and talk about the infrastructure I think we need to develop within the statistical system to do to bring in these kinds of real-time data from the private sector and to be able to produce high value, high quality economic statistics from them. So let's just start with the familiar preliminaries. First of all, one thing that the stat agencies have been struggling with for decades, and I think became particularly salient during the pandemic, is declining survey and census response rates. So it is getting more and more difficult to convince households, businesses to participate in surveys. Most of us on this meeting right now often get excited when surveys show up at our houses, but that's not true of the public at large. But also partly related to declining response rates, but to other issues as well. It's getting more expensive to do primary data collection. But on the same token, we have lots of much more interest in the products that stat agencies produce or other institutions that are able to put out useful information about the economy or other things of interest. And we're going to hear from Fiona in a few minutes about all the great work that they were doing. And then we got these great opportunities. Computing is much better. There not only is the hardware and faster, but we got much more software and tools to use to analyze the data. And then, as we've been describing here, this proliferation of alternative third-party source data that just opens up whole new vistas. But let me give you maybe a less familiar preliminary. I think the things I just said you've probably heard either me say or others say in some venue. But I think one thing that was just a huge wake-up call during the pandemic is the lack of resiliency of a lot of the paths of getting data. So first of all, the pandemic, natural disasters, social unrest we were dealing with, impact survey operations. So for the 2020 census, ACS, the CPS, our mail center was closed down. We weren't sending people out into the field. We had to delay field work for the census. We suspended field work for the ACS, which if you've been following developments on the 2020 year of the ACS, we got some pretty big non-response issues because we couldn't get out in the field. And then kind of a related thing, with the CPS, not only was the survey operations impacted, but the we had some issues with looking at employment, with how the question was being delivered to respondents, and Census and BLS had to work to kind of retrain interviewers and stuff like that. So it's just these types of things that in normal times you're just not thinking about, but with a big shock like the pandemic sort of shows the lack of resiliency of these data collection platforms. But not only for surveys, shocks delay deliveries of administrative data. So moving the tax filing deadline, states changing UI filing deadlines and stuff like that, all impact the flow of those administrative data to places like Census and BLS. And so I think that's something that I don't think too many people kind of have a sense for. But unfortunately, these things happen exactly when the demand for our data is the highest. And so somehow I think we need to figure out a way to solve this problem so that we're not having it in the future when we have some other shock to the economy. Hopefully not a big one, but I think what we do know is that these things happened in local areas, like during Katrina and stuff like that before, but you kind of get masked in the sort of macro picture. All right, so can we produce the high frequency statistics that policymakers, that researchers need during these sort of crises? And I think the answer is yes, but I think Mary was giving us some heads up, but with some substantial effort. So the big things that Census did, we put out these 2 pulse surveys for small businesses and for households, and that was a huge lift. And to get those developed and approved through OMB and launched within a couple months was a big task, and it was amazing that we got it done. But you can't do that all the time. We were able to adjust our business formation statistics to go to a weekly that I think folks found useful. But largely that benefited from several years of research that led up to it by folks from Census and the Fed. And so it was easy to turn that switch. But if you hadn't already done all that spade work before, you wouldn't have been able to do that. And I think Mary kind of mentioned a couple things like that too. That at BEA they were doing some work, and it was easy to do some extra things, some on the margin, to help during the pandemic. But then we also released this state level monthly retail sales using a bit of the kind of vision that Pat was putting out. So we got some third party data that somebody else is already aggregating information from large retailers around the country that we were able to take advantage of to push our monthly data down to the state level, and also looking forward to doing it even at lower levels and higher frequencies in the future as we get more data. So it's important here to realize all these things required additional source data. And so what we really need to be able to do is to engineer ways to get source data into the agencies quickly, assess it, and then produce the high quality statistics that we want to do. So this goal then is to use alternative third party data and then combine that with the survey and administrative data that we already have to produce more timely, more detailed, and perhaps less burdensome on our respondents data products going forward. And so, great example obviously was what we did with the retail sales, where we're blending survey administrative data from the IRS and the data we got from this third party aggregator. So, but I think one thing that's happening right now that if you've been following this, but it's really quite striking how we've sort of in a relatively short period of time for the ACS really increased its awareness and use of administrative data to try to help with the non-response bias issues that we had from the pandemic last year during data collection. ACS has been exploring using administrative data for some time, but in a very slow and methodical fashion. I think that this shock has sort of given that new urgency to bringing in survey data to sort of improve their estimates. So let me talk about how we at the Census Bureau are trying to build the tools and the infrastructure that we need to be able to do this stuff more rapidly and at scale, so that perhaps we can plug into the kind of vision that Pat laid out beforehand, but do it in a way that we can give it the same sort of quality and transparency types of guarantees that is expected of a statistical agency. So this slide, maybe some of you saw it yesterday afternoon. John Abowd provided a glimpse of this, and when talking about using administrative data, but this is really about all of the source data that the Census Bureau brings in, and it's just an infrastructure to support doing blended statistics. And so what I want to focus on is the middle of this, which really is what makes this work. And so at the Census Bureau, we have several frames that we use for survey operations. The census and the ACS are based off of what we call the master address frame, a geospatial frame of housing units. The economic census and all our business surveys are based off the business register, which is a list of businesses operating in the country and their locations and their ownership structure and what have you. We also have implicitly a jobs frame from the LHD program that connects businesses to households via workers, via jobs. And we also have an implicit demographic frame that we get from the census, from the ACS, or other household surveys, and from some administrative records as well. And those things all sit currently in silos, and they support survey operations, but they don't really support the use of blended data, bringing new data in and assessing that, and then creating statistics from it. And that's really what this project that we're about. So what we want to do is we want to evolve these frames, we want to improve them, but we also want to link them together, so that the household frame is connected to the business frame much more formally through the jobs, for instance. That the household frame, the master address file, which has addresses for group quarters like jails and college dormitories and old folks' homes, but it has that as housing units. That connects back to the business register that often has those same addresses in the business register as a business or a government operation or something like that, and is collecting data from them on a more real-time basis than once a decade for the census. And so the idea that we can get these things talking to each other would provide a lot of efficiencies for our operations, but also opens up this whole sort of venue for bringing in new data, attaching that to these frames, and producing statistical information from them. So I probably got to be somewhat cognizant of the time here. So one thing I want to point out here. So if you're thinking about this third-party data, and you see that little star over there on the left, at least for statistical purposes, Census Bureau can get that data, bring it through this sort of curated environment, blend it with other information, and then be able to produce more reliable statistical information than you could perhaps with just the third-party data sitting there. So Mary talked about coverage issues, quality issues, and things like that, especially when maybe that third-party data is not as stable in the sense that companies agree today, but maybe not tomorrow. You need some way to sort that out, and that's really what this frames vision is all about. But then that flows through to the right hand side of the figure, and you produce high quality data products. I would just say, I think there's potential here to use this kind of environment for things that maybe aren't the sort of direct domain of the stat agencies of producing economic and social.
Is everything okay?
Mary?
Oh, sorry. Everything's okay.
Yeah, everything's great.
Everything's okay.
So I thought maybe I was like twitching on the screen or something like that. So anyway, I think this infrastructure might be beneficial for uses kind of outside the direct domain interests of the stat agencies, and that's something that maybe going forward. And Pat talked about changes in legislation. There's other ways that we can think about changes in legislation that might produce a set of tools for the broader community that might be beneficial. And so I interested in having those kind of conversations going forward. So just let me kind of wrap up here and say what does this give us? And so the first thing, and this is kind of a little bit of a mantra I have inside the Bureau, is it gives us the tools to manage the estimate as opposed to the data collection platform. So the Census Bureau, and I think other stat agencies, especially the ones that have large data collection activities, the platform, the ACS, the CPS, the census, kind of is the management tool of that drives everything, and not necessarily the estimates that come out the back end. And I think to really improve data and serve our users better, we have to think about the estimates more than the platforms. And that I think this gives us that tool. It gives subject matter experts the data and the linkages that they're going to need to be able to make high quality data products for the public. But really importantly for this conversation, it gives us the ability to do coverage and quality assessments of incoming third-party data, to do weighting adjustments, to do all of the things that you need to do to produce sort of scientifically valid estimates out of the back end from inputs that were not intended for those kinds of purposes. I think an interesting thing that I think we're excited about in the Census Bureau is it allows us to do targeted sampling. So think about during the pandemic when we got the household pulse survey out there, how much more valuable would that have been if we were able to target it to households that had the largest impact? And so a lot of us that worked in offices that just started working from home, our incomes didn't change. Not a huge impact on our lives other than missing our friends and colleagues and being stuck inside all the time. But for some folks, it was a huge shock to their income. For folks working in hospitals, obviously a huge shock to their sort of daily routines. If we were able to target the household pulse survey to see how households in those more impacted areas were faring, I think we would have been able to have a lot better data. So this notion that these frames are connected and linked together gives us much more flexibility on how we think about sampling. Obviously, one of the things that we'd like to see come from this is better resiliency to these pandemics and or other types of disasters. That our data collection platforms are that we have alternative data that we can rely on. May not be as good, but it's better than nothing. But also that we've designed this in ways that we can respond to those things in much more real time. I think importantly, it allows us to think about solving some long-term issues that we've had with like the census, with undercount of kids. Is we go out and we get alternative source data and link that back to the census, but do it in real time across the decade and not be relying on sort of the one-shot data collection at the end of the decade. And then last and maybe most important for the public is new cool data products that could be produced by having this infrastructure in place that allows us to be much more flexible, much more nimble, and able to produce high quality statistics from data that was never meant to produce high quality statistics. So Eric, I'll stop there, and thanks.
Thank you so much, Ron. I really like that chart and the overview of things. And I also, by the way, I see that there are about half a dozen questions in the Q&A. That's terrific. We'll be taking those in about 15 minutes. If others want to ask questions, feel free to just put them into the Q&A function. Next up, we have Fiona Gregg. She's the Managing Director and Co-President of the JP Morgan Chase Institute. Fiona, take it away.
Thanks, Eric. Great to be here this morning with all of you. I thought I would bring to bear a lot of the examples that we have been working on from the JP Morgan Chase Institute. In many ways, this is a study less in the big national statistics, but actually in the promise of administrative data to understand the world from sort of a micro picture up. Very briefly, the Institute has been up and running for 7 years. And the idea of it was, can we use the balance sheet of $2.5 trillion of JP Morgan Chase, which banks roughly half the households in the US and over 2 million small businesses to understand any number of policy questions that policymakers, business leaders, and the like might be wrestling with. And so over those years, we've been leveraging checking account data, credit card data, savings account data, mortgage data to inform a range of topics. Today, I'm going to be really focusing on 3 examples of these of the use of these data. One is around all of these examples actually come from the COVID era, where I think everybody on this Zoom will attest to the importance of data in much higher frequency in real time during COVID, when things changed so very quickly. So the first example is around the evolution of cash balances among households. The second is around how small businesses were doing at the ground level in a place like Chicago, and by industry, and how that can inform targeting COVID relief. And the third is around measuring gig work over time, the rise of gig work, and of course, the huge expansion of the unemployment insurance program during COVID. What is the impact of that? These examples, I think, offer an illustration of some of the key advantages I see in administrative data. Obviously, large samples help us move away from aggregates and means and shed light on the distributional aspects, geographic granularity, and other subgroups of interest. They're high frequency, they have this longitudinal nature, but probably the thing I want to emphasize most, and which I've come to appreciate over time, is actually how adaptable these data become to changing economic and policy environments. And I think this third example of gig work is a nice illustration of that, where of course, as we are designing our instruments, we are very, very focused on making sure that they are comparable across time, that they might be also comparable to other data sets. And yet in that very intentional design, we lose the flexibility in some ways to measure distinct phenomena that are coming out of nowhere that we might not have foreseen, like something like gig work. Okay, so example number 1, I think it's been widely cited in the media that we have seen a rise in the savings rate. We have seen cash balances rise. And yet, if you turn to public data sets on this, for example, deposits in all commercial banks, you will see this evidence of this. And yet it feels so unsatisfactory. It's like, yes, but for whom and when and exactly why and how. And so we realized there was really an opportunity to shed light on this in a much more high frequency, granular way, where so here we're just publishing a percent change in cash balances, checking account balances among families by different income segments, right? So lowest income here is the darkest line, and the highest income segment is the lightest line. And these are 2-year changes, so percent change relative to 2 years ago, so that we are washing out the COVID era as we enter into 2021 and beyond. And what becomes very clear here, and the second thing I would say is these are medians, right? We know there is a long tail, right tail in cash balances, and so the aggregate, the average will not really speak to what the typical family is experiencing. And so what becomes clear from this is, wow, the stimulus really did play a role As Pat suggested, particularly for low-income families, we see this huge heartbeat with each round of stimulus, and yet they're still elevated, right? Even as of the end of September in 2022 or 2021, cash balances are up, and they're most notably up for low-income families, which, of course, that subsegment analysis helps us understand, wow, this might be playing a role in terms of sort of where are all of our missing workers? Why are we experiencing labor shortages? Maybe cash balances are playing a role. Who knows? So this is one example of how that distributional and subgroup and plus high frequency can really, I think, create much more of an insightful picture than the picture before. The second example comes from our work from small businesses.
Hi, Fiona. Your mic sort of cut out a little bit and it's coming back sometimes. I don't know if there's a way you can adjust that.
How is that now? Am I better?
It's not great, actually. It's sometimes it's really good, and then sometimes it seems very distant, and I'm not sure why.
How am I now?
Audible, but not as loud as you were before.
Jeez. Okay. I will.
Yeah, maybe just move a little closer. I don't know, but I mean, we can hear you, but for a while it was really clear, and now it's a little bit like in a different room.
Okay, I will do my best to.
Actually, this is good what you're saying right now.
Okay, great. Thanks for that intervention. So I was talking about household balances, and if the picture for households is sometimes available, the picture for small businesses is even harder to get access to, right? And specifically for local decision makers. And during COVID, local authorities received enormous amounts of COVID relief, which they were struggling to figure out, okay, how do I deploy this money to the greatest impact? And so we received inbound from officials in the state of Illinois, but also Cook County, Chicago, trying to understand, okay, well, which kinds of businesses should we direct this support to? And so, we were able to show if we just look at the percent change in revenues and expenses, from the beginning of the pandemic through to February 2021, we can see that, businesses in the central business district of Chicago really fared worse. Huge drop in revenue growth, huge cutback in expenses. And by the industry level, it's not just restaurants, which we've heard a lot about in the media, but it's also personal services, things like, hair salons, nail salons, dry cleaning, et cetera. And so if you've ever worked with local officials, they pay attention to data, but there's nothing more powerful than data in their jurisdiction to power those decisions. And so this actually led to them channeling, calling out personal services firms explicitly and directing some of that aid to those types of businesses. So I think this is an example of, how we can point data at, in a much more geographical, granular way to make it relevant to our local decision makers who are often making huge choices around public funds. The third example is, I'm going to rewind back a couple of years and remind you of, 2014, when we were probably all first downloading, Uber and Lyft onto our phones and starting to change the way we were moving around the world, and realizing that the growth of these platforms had implications for our labor markets and the structure of work. And so, we received this question inbound, maybe we can use Chase data to help inform this rise of so-called gig work. And sure enough, we dove into the transaction data to see if we could find families who were earning income off of these different types of platforms. And we categorized them into 4 different ones, right? Transportation platforms, like non-transport work, selling, leasing. And sure enough, could document that there had been a huge increase in the share of families generating income from these different types of platforms. Now, at the time, this was, a real sort of dark spot in terms of what we knew from national statistics. The BLS's contingent worker survey was the way in which we normally measure this phenomenon. And if you can see in this chart, if we're sitting in 2014, where I began my story, it had been 9-10 years since that survey had last been implemented. And so we had almost no information from the contingent worker survey about what was happening. And so they did implement it again in 2017, and yet the questions they realized could not really capture this online platform piece of it, and that they had to actually generate new questions to measure what they called electronically mediated work. And they did so, they implemented, and sure enough, they came out with similar numbers that we came out with. But all to say, this was, I think it illustrates, an example of the ways in which, we can point some of these administrative data at phenomena before we even had the forethought to bake them into our survey instruments or otherwise. Now, roll this story forward, we've updated these data and can show what's happening to these platform workers during COVID. And if you just focus on the dark orange line, these are the drivers on platforms. And sure enough, in COVID, they took a huge hit. Huge numbers of droves of drivers fell off these platforms. There was no work, there was no driving around. Probably a lot of them shifted to delivering food rather than driving people around. But needless to say, they did experience a big drop in their platform income. And so that tells us, okay, what's going on? But at the same time, we also changed our policy environment, right? We engaged in the largest expansion of UI, of unemployment insurance ever in this country, not just the level of benefits and the duration of those benefits, but also who was eligible. And as illustrated in this chart, we expanded unemployment insurance eligibility to contingent workers. And the red volume here is showing that PUA program, the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program claims. And as you can see, it was an enormous expansion in the program, right? Roughly 40% of claims were for these types of contingent workers. And yet, beyond claims data, we don't know how effective was this program. Should we do it again in the next recession? How should we be changing or expanding our eligibility criteria, for a future recession? And so we turn to our data to say, okay, all right, let's look at our sample of platform workers. Are they receiving unemployment insurance? And this is any form of UI, but sure enough, again, that orange line, the drivers who had seen the biggest drop in their participation were most likely to receive UI. At the peak, roughly 1 in 5 drivers was receiving unemployment insurance. And so evidently they really did benefit from UI generally. Now, was that specifically PUA? Here, it's probably worth noting that we're really pushing the data hard here, right? I started with a sample of, let's say, millions and millions of people, only 1% of whom are, in the platform economy. And now 1 in 5 of them are receiving UI, right? So we're cutting the sample down really, really hard. And so can we say anything about the PUA program specifically? Well, it turns out, yes. In a few states, they have been administering the PUA program separately, distinctly from regular UI. They come in on different transaction strings, and we were able to separate them out. And as economists, we tend to focus on the economics of policy and perhaps not enough on the plumbing of policy. And so just one illustration of how important that plumbing is. One of the things we noted, if we just look at the size of those unemployment payments from the first payment onwards, right? So week 0 is the first time that unemployment insurance check is received. And you can see that if you look at PUA recipients, right, that first check is much bigger than the subsequent checks, much more so than regular UI recipients, both during the pandemic in orange and prior to the pandemic in green. And that's evident of that back pay being reflected in that first payment, and that so that they're receiving that payment on quite a delayed basis, right? 6 or 7 weeks after they filed the claim. So all to say, I think, as this is a very rapidly changing economic environment, right? New form of work, new forms of policy. What are the impacts of that? And I think that's another advantage of the administrative data is the ability to kind of mine what is a treasure trove, but to invest in those transaction strings, et cetera, where that might not have been the original point, but can really shed light on some of these very small subgroups of real importance. I started with the advantages, obviously, but I think it's really important to think about administrative data as a complement to our national statistics and representative samples. And here I've tried to just lay out, some of the contrast between the two. I think there are two really important things to underscore, which Ron and others have underscored also, is obviously around how the samples are constructed. Of course, these data are a byproduct of operations. They fall out of the administrivia of a bank operation or any number of private sector operations, not carefully designed to be representative of the country or carefully designed to be comparable over time or comparable to other constructs in other data sets. And so, it really does require attention to those potential drawbacks, either through benchmarking or, understanding how the sample construction could be influenced by, in our speak, sometimes chase effects, right? Of like who's in our portfolio, who's using our products and services, could change that representativeness over time. So I'll close by giving certainly a nod to how we work with others, and I'll probably save a discussion of this for our Q&A. But needless to say, we have been thinking about how to work with people, how to work with other data sets, and I would be happy to spend more time on the opportunities, but also the constraints around this in our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fiona. That was terrific. I really liked some of those charts. In fact, all of you, I hope you can share the slides, because I think there's so much good material in there. We do have a bunch of questions in Q&A, and I encourage the participants to the audience to add more if they'd like. But I'm going to give chairman's privilege to John Haltwanger for the first question. He's the chairman of the American Economic Association Committee on Statistics, and I know you have a couple of questions, John. That was the organization that organized this panel. So. Go ahead, John.
Thanks, Eric. That was a great set of presentations. Thanks to all of you for your presentations. So I actually want to push a little. This is a question actually for all panelists. In some sense, it's really, in many ways, it's for Ron and Mary, but Fiona raised it right at the end. And that's the question as we move forward. Do we see this as just complements? As clearly we see this as complements. That is, there's official statistics out there, and there's just amazing new data that Pat and Fiona, and but actually Ron and Mary have talked about, that fill in the gaps, that give us granularity in all kinds of different dimensions, and everybody did a great job of that. But Ron in particular also mentioned there's declining response rates, particularly in the monthly surveys. So do we see a time where that at least some of this isn't just complements, but is substitutes? And put differently, it's a little related to Ron's chart in terms of a blended data environment. Do we see a time where, again, it's not just filling in the gaps, but it actually is helping us provide the official statistics? If I'm not mistaken, both Census and BEA are doing a bit of that already. So anyway, it'd be nice to hear a little bit more on the complements versus substitutes.
Ron, you want to take that first?
Yeah, so I'll jump in. So just let me say, I think a little bit of the vision we're trying to accomplish with frames here is that we use universe level administrative data augmented with some other things to sort of know who our sort of corporal units are in the economy that we're interested in measuring. And then everything else is just adding contextual information to those units. So whether it's a survey response, whether it's administrative data on income or UI receipt or something like that, whether it's cadastral information from counties across the country about what the built environment looks like, what the taxes paid, who owns things, that sort of stuff. And then whether we get third-party data in from companies on transactions or other types of things, all of that are measurements, if you will, of these primary units that we're interested in describing, how they interact with each other, and we get the economy. And I think what that then does is allows you to assess the quality and the sort of temporal reliability and the other issues, sort of these kind of measurement type concerns about the different sources that you get. And allows you, as you construct your estimates, to optimize across the available data, and then to use your surveys much more precisely to fill in gaps to give more scientific validity to maybe something that you think is a little squirrely. But rather than using these large platforms to do lots of things, maybe we move eventually to a bunch of small targeted surveys. My favorite example inside the Bureau is income estimations, right? We have income questions on the SIP, the ACS, and the CPS, and then we have administrative data from the IRS. Well, the administrative data from the IRS is probably good for 80-90% of the population, and why we would think we would use the same survey platform to get the bottom and the top of the income distribution. When we know our colleagues at the Fed, go out and get high income households in a different survey. I think if you were really interested in producing high quality income estimates, you would probably think about doing it differently. And I think that's the notion that we need to build the infrastructure that allows us to make those sort of estimate specific decisions about how we want to measure a particular phenomena, and not rely on this big one size fits all kind of survey platform to go out and get our data. So I guess I wouldn't view them as substitutes or complements. They're all just measurements, and we're trying to choose the best measurements for the task at hand. So Mary, you want to add on to that?
Well, Ron, yeah, I would add, I agree with everything you've said. And I think back to the presentation, there's some key things we need to be able to do, look at quality, Ron, benchmarking, how can we have continuity over time? And we hear that policymakers want that. We hear that, there's a high value in being able to take the key components of our GDP measures back to the beginning. That's costly. It's not something we would do unless we knew there was demand and we keep checking. So there's some things that we know we have to have as attributes. And then I think Ron just nicely explained how there's new technology and new systems, and let's look for the best way to bring all these things together. I do think over time there will be parts of the statistical system that will start dropping surveys. Statistics Canada has started dropping some agricultural surveys because they're using satellite data, and originally they benchmarked, but they've dropped at least one survey.
Mean literally satellites in the sky?
Yep. Before they went out and talked to people and took field level measurements, but they were able to develop equally effective things and have stopped at least one survey, and I think they're working to do less. So I think there's potential, and it'll be where it makes sense.
Thanks, Mary. Pat, I think you had some thoughts on this too.
In an ideal world, it would be both. If I think about the example I gave about retail sales, this is just an automation of what's already happening. Like, I'm pretty sure we respond to the survey, and there's somebody in our finance group who writes a notebook and executes it against data lake. And they do that, at the survey frequency, and then they send it in. So the process I described makes it more robust, and actually, if the agencies thought about their jobs a little bit differently, like under an NDA, make sure that out of the 20 different definitions of revenue or GMS that are there, that they're pulling out the right ones, you'd increase the accuracy. So for a lot of these things, it's an automation of kind of the clunky and somewhat outdated, from a pure tech viewpoint, ways in which data is collected. And there's other places where it's a complement. When I joined FESAC, I asked one of our economists at Amazon, who is an old census employee, I said, what's the most important econometric statistical problem you run across? And he said, imputation. Like these machine learning and related models are wonderful for imputation. And, there's other places where you can create alternative indices and series, but I mean, it's really both. And I don't think you should refer to this as alternative data anymore. Like, this is what the data looks like and is. And you're just kind of modernizing the tooling on the other side to be responsive to the infrastructure that's inside not just large companies, but increasingly medium and smaller companies.
Although, Pat, as Fiona brought up, I mean, there are some issues around representativeness, and so it's not necessarily what the data are if you're not getting the sample of the entire universe.
Yeah, you know how I think of that is I'd make a distinction between the head and the tail.
Yeah.
On the head of the distribution, this type of distributed system over cloud is very easy to do. On the tail, think of something like what mint.com does. You know, go put in an app that sucks in, have panelists that volunteer that are cool with it, and go have an app that sucks in and automates that process. There'll be some places where you still need surveys, but I think there's a difference between the head and the tail. And most of output is in the head of the distribution. I mean, this goes back to zip and was it 20s or something. Lots of things follow power laws.
Sure.
For very good reasons.
Right. No, absolutely. You're totally right. And you get most of the sample with a relatively, like you said, the top 100 retailers. But Fiona, I mean, you had a much broader distribution of folks in there. Maybe you could say something about that.
Well, I think the head and the tail analogy, is right. And at the same time, if you extrapolate that to families, most of the spending is, it comes from high income families, right? So if you take the head and the tail kind of analogy to consumer spending, you're really talking about, okay, well, is it good enough to just study the spending of the top half of the income distribution? We'll get most of it, right? And yet most of our safety program or public safety or public safety net programs are tilted towards the bottom half of the income distribution. And so, when in this dialectic between sort of, complements versus substitutes, I think when we're talking about aggregate activity, I think actually public statistics could over time become substituted for, or become powered by a lot of administrative or private sector data. When it comes to the subsamples and distributional aspects that we really, really care about, I think it may remain in more of a complement arrangement, right? Because it's hard to, it's feasible and perhaps reasonable to ask the top 100 corporations to answer the question, Pat, in the way that you pose, which is an automated daily push of a feed of an aggregate number, but it may not be reasonable to ask them to do so for all segments of the population and with granularity.
Yeah, so it depends a lot on the question you're asking. I mean, if you're looking at sort of total spending or total retail sales, maybe that you can take advantage of the Pareto. If you really want to target some of the smaller retailers or some of the smaller lower income people, then obviously you're going to need a different data set. Let me start getting some questions from the Q&A side here. Rob Siemens asked a question, actually mainly for you, Fiona, but I think anyone can come in. And he was asking about the child tax credits that really seem to prop up the balances, especially around the third round of stimulus. Have you done any analysis predicting how the expiration of the CTC may affect balances going forward? So if you started analyzing some of these data, that they're sort of doing it in reverse.
Yes, absolutely. And actually it's on our website. So I can pull it up very briefly. But the short answer is yes, we've looked at families based on we've looked at household balance trends, whether they received the CTC versus not. And, we definitely see that families who had received the child tax credit, their balances are more elevated than otherwise than the rest of the population, but perhaps not as much as you might have thought. So it was surprising to me that we didn't see actually a big boost in balances around the time of the child tax credit. And that's partly because it's actually a much smaller aggregate outlay than stimulus, for example. So I can very briefly share.
Well, let me, while you grab that, let me, okay, you got it right there. Okay, that was quick.
Yeah, so, you can see, sure, yeah, you do see that the CTC is helping to slow down the spend down of that third round of stimulus, and we're going to continue to look at this. Obviously, CTC was just expired, so but it's not the case that you see a huge spike in balances in a level sense around each round of the CTC. This is in dollars. So, but this is all on our public website. You're welcome to take a look.
Thank you. That's terrific. You could do that so much in real-time answers to real-time data. Here's a question from Linling Fang, mainly for you, Ron. Again, others may want to go. How does the pandemic affect the quality of the 2020 census, the CPS, the ACS, et cetera? I know you did some heroic efforts to overcome some once-in-a-century challenges on that.
Well, I think in terms of the resulting data quality, the impact is probably the highest on the ACS. We were out of the field for, 4 months, little over 4 months, I think. And in the ACS, that's partly an online survey, or a paper survey, or a in-person survey. And it turns out that the in-person is follow-up to non-responding households, and those households are very different than those who respond online or through the mail.
So you get this sample bias thing again.
Right, and so losing that much in-field data collection, it's not the census, we just delayed the data collection. We couldn't make up because the ACS is in the field every month, and so we just lost that much in-field work and couldn't make it up.
A lot of private companies and universities like mine, the pandemic was a big impetus to go do stuff online, learn how to teach online, learn how to do other stuff online. Was it a catalyst in the government agencies to maybe do some more stuff online that you'd been hoping to do anyways, but this kind of accelerated the timetable?
Well, of course it was. So first of all, we all started working from home. That's one thing, like everybody else. But I think in the pulse surveys, one of the things, everyone's excited to have the data, but both of those surveys were the outreach is completely online. So with the small business pulse, it was emails. So we had email addresses on our business register for over 1 million businesses, and I think it's higher now. And then we worked with Qualtrics on the household pulse survey, and we used text messaging and emails to reach out to households. And so obviously, remember, in March through probably May, I don't think we didn't have the ability to mail. So we have all of our surveys are mailed out of a processing center in Jeffersonville, Indiana, where they did some heroic things to keep things going as much, but they couldn't, they couldn't be in the building to do all the mailing, and we were kind of focused on a few things around the decennial census and stuff. And so the importance of being able to use that kind of contact strategy was huge. Now, obviously, you're not going to get a representative sample using that kind of contact strategy today. But as we move forward in the future, I think it'll become more and more reliable. And so it's something we really want to be, we want to be able to get to our respondents where they are. I, for one, am not a very careful reader of the mail. If it doesn't look like
the paper mail
I need to be concerned about, it goes right into the trash. And so
it is interesting. Paper mail has become 90% junk mail, but then there's these like a small percentage of incredibly important things.
Right. Yeah. Somehow we need to distinguive those two. I'm not sure. We do research on what to put on an envelope to make people open it.
You've just won $1,000.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Thanks, Pat. Well, first off, Pat, Amazon has been a bit of a lifeline, at least for my household, in terms of continuing to have stuff delivered during the pandemic. But maybe you can say something about the data side as well.
I just wanted to add in one point. I think it might have been Ron that said this. The times when you need the data the most are the times it's frequently the most difficult to collect. For
Yes.
example, during the start of the pandemic, I don't know if this was true in the US, but in the UK, they didn't let the people go out to stores to go and look at what the prices were. So here the central banks are throwing absurd amounts of money into the economy, and they can't see what's happening to the price level, output, etc. I guarantee you these companies companies run off of software. They're still recording those transactions on those databases. Those databases are living very frequently on big cloud farms, and it's still there. Puerto Rico, when it was hit by the hurricane, I think is another nice example. You really wanted to help it recover, and people couldn't even get through the roads. So have you overstimulated or understimulated? Where are the needs the worst? These are things you can actually measure or have a better shot at measuring because of how it's collected. And this is a little bit more true on the side of firms than perhaps on the side of consumers. But I do think these new technologies can help you out during some of these extreme events when we need it the most.
For sure, they can help. And you amended that to say they can help you have a shot at, because you don't always know if the stuff that's in the store is what's in the data set. I mean, unfortunately, that's also the time that the software and data may be more likely to be misaligned with what's happening on the ground. But yeah.
Oh, you could have extreme stockouts.
Yeah, exactly.
Which I guarantee you will matter for the measurement of inflation if you do it correctly.
Right. Yeah. Stockout is like a very, very high price in some ways. Mary?
Yeah, no, good discussion. And I think that all these data sources help you out. And this portfolio idea is valuable, as well as a mindset on innovation. I would say the pandemic accelerated things we've been working on. We have one set of surveys around services, trade, and also on multinational companies. And we've been investing a lot to automate them. And that was invaluable because we really weren't able to send people into the building to get the paper surveys, but we had most of what we needed coming in electronically. And, we reached out to the main companies and built on the relationships we'd established. So I think for data collection, automation is key. In terms of other things, we had this mindset of trying to put out experimental products before they were fully vetted and baked. And that really proved valuable. I said a month was way faster than we'd ever done anything. So getting the, card transaction data paper out and numbers out on the street, that accelerated something beyond where we'd been, but it built on the mindset to experiment and do new things and make them available in a timely way.
Thanks. Let me go to another Q&A question up. So Ken Trotsky asks a question or makes a comment that some of the platform, for instance, that you were describing, Pat, for coordinating the data between businesses and the federal government could also be applied to other levels of government, like state and local governments. We don't have anyone here on the panel right now from one of those groups. But what are your thoughts about other entities that might coordinate and might be able to benefit from these data? And if you have time, we could even broaden it to academic institutions. But let's start with the state and local governments.
I was not super deep into this, but Justine Hastings, who is an economist at Brown, she just moved over to Amazon full time.
Mm-hmm.
She told me a lot about an organization she started called Ripple. And one of the big goals of Ripple was to merge different forms of data sets that were already sitting there within the states. And she said, a problem with academic policy papers is they're too slow. I think she was pretty close to the governor of that state, and they need answers within a week or two. When she set up this type of infrastructure, they could take Victor Chernozhuk's double ML and boom, you'd have, because they had set up a properly engineered, I don't like the word platform, I just say like this is proper engineering, a properly engineered thing, so you can solve many problems in a repeatable and very, very fast way. And I think she even said that this was helping to get out UI benefits more quickly, because the underlying data sets that the states had, the way in which they were doing the IT took quite a while to get the checks out correctly.
Thanks.
Yeah, another
ahead,
example
Fiona.
I would offer would be the California Policy Lab. You know, they have been, I think, up and running for 3, 4, 5 years, and have, as I understand it, almost 30 or so data use agreements across California, different agencies, both at the state and local county levels, across social services and beyond, and they had been quite instrumental to us around unemployment insurance. Some of the things that we were seeing, they were also seeing. Like, I'll give you one quick example. We were really trying to understand the work disincentive effects of unemployment insurance. And in March of 2021, this past year, we saw kind of a big increase in exit rates out of unemployment insurance. And we wondered, oh, well, is that because the vaccine has become available and everybody is going back to work, or, restrictions are being lifted and people are actually exiting? And one of the things that we saw in some states, not all, but California, and they documented, was that actually about 500,000 people in California on UI lost their UI benefits right as they came upon the end of their benefit year.
Wow.
And that was because they had to file a transitional claim to go from federal benefits to state benefits, which they were eligible for. And yet they fell off of UI because of this sort of red tape, right? And so we were seeing it certainly in California and some other states that had this requirement. So all to say, I think, some of the action at the state level by, California Policy Lab, Ripple, is super exciting. And insofar as so much of this policy making and the plumbing of the policy, implementation happens at the state level, it's super powerful.
Thanks. Marshall Reinsdorf has a question. Several of you, Pat and Ron both mentioned about the potential need for legislation when private organizations want to or share information and data. Can either of you or any of you say more about what has been written, or has anybody been researching or recommending the kinds of legislation that's needed?
Yeah, I'll just say that what I've seen is it's extremely difficult to be a good citizen with the way that legislation is written, and in the problems I've been talking about, like the tech. I was talking to one of our principal engineers at Amazon about the tech that would be required to do some of the problems I talked about in census. He's like, this is almost trivial. Like, I should give this to SD1. It's not hard tech. The stuff that's standing in the middle of the way is proper really a legislative infrastructure, so everybody gets coordinated and on the same page. And I'll tell you, I think that if it was done right, companies would support this. Like, when you're inside a company, you're getting hit by a huge business cycle. Like, you don't know how much of what's hitting you is the cycle versus failures in your own performance. Or this example of, suppose you could make GDP or other levels of output county level. And I was running a fixed income portfolio. Well, I bet you I could price risk a hell of a lot more accurately. If I knew a firm had a lot of exposure to a particular area. So I do think there's a really large gain from trade that could be exploited for both sides, because companies do need these statistics.
Mm-hmm.
And if they're better and they're faster, more accurate, more reliable, I think you'd have some people, not everyone, but you have some people who'd be advocates for it.
Thanks. Anyone
Yeah,
else on the? Go ahead, Ron. Yeah.
What I would say is that clearly there needs to be a conversation going on, and I don't think that anybody really has the right complete vision in mind of how to try to help the Congress think about, how to write laws to make data this sort of infrastructure type thing for the economy. That would really help us out. And what I do know right now in DC, a lot of the discussions around evidence-based policymaking, and that's great and important, and I think will be helpful. But in some sense, it's missing the forest for the trees, right? There is a much bigger potential thing that we should be having a discussion about, and we're worrying about kind of divvying up what already exists and not thinking about what could exist. And I hope conversations like this help try to get people interested in having that broader conversation, because it needs to involve a lot more than economists, and it's going to be lawyers and other interested stakeholders in this for that could be hugely beneficial for the economy going forward. And I don't see us having that conversation right now.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. John?
So I thought I'd weigh in. Marshall's question is great, and I think that the discussion about, you could say, what kind of changes in infrastructure we might need. I think it's useful to think about one change in legislation that we've long been talking about, and I actually think this discussion suggests we need to go perhaps much beyond it. So something that many of us on this panel, but also I can see on all the participants, are well aware of, is we do not have the data sharing or synchronization that enables BLS and BEA and census to access FTIs to be able to coordinate their measurement of their statistics. And I remain convinced, even with this new vision today, that's important. So I think one answer to Marshall's question is data synchronization. But listening to this discussion, it needs to get broader, right? It's not going to just be make sure you can share the federal administrative data, but somehow or another, I'll call it the vision, Ron's chart, that shouldn't be a chart where it's only census getting that flow in a particular kind of way. It needs to be census and BLS and BA and other agencies. And so this kind of both a comment and a question is how do we overcome the barriers that currently exist between the stat agencies to kind of achieve this kind of vision that Ron talked about? I think that's a huge challenge, given the great possibilities there, but we know there are struggles that go on in terms of the coordination across the agency. So anyway, I think partly to answer Marshall's question is data synchronization on FTI, but also pushing further towards the integration of blended private and public data. I think that's and I don't know how to make that happen either. So, but I think that's let me see what this discussion suggests we need to do.
And then we'll go to Fiona. But Mary, I'm going to give you that nice, easy question.
Yeah, well, I want to take a slightly different tact and point to something where we could learn some lessons learned from work already underway in the private sector, that NPD, Nielsen, IRI, they do this data aggregation. And I think talking to them about lessons learned in their contracting or operations would be valuable. There's also companies that we buy from, like JD Powers or other places, health sector companies that bring together statistics that provide information. And I think we could learn some lessons and bring them into the conversation in terms of what's needed to make this kind of activity work, both federally, and maybe thoughts of how we could make their part work better. And we don't have to replace them as federal agencies, but tie into the services they're providing.
Thanks, Mary. Fiona?
Yeah, just a small point. I mean, I work within an organization within JP Morgan Chase where, our remit is data for good, right? And so you can imagine, as we think about blending public-private sources, that then maybe we need to rethink around what the private sector is and is not, or how it's regulated in the way of data use, and all with an eye towards ethical use of data and protections of consumer data, of course, like lead with all of that. But perhaps things like, I mean, Pat mentioned it, private corporations aren't allowed to give things of value to the government. Well, an enormously valuable thing we have is data, and so we receive inbound from federal agencies at times, can we have X? And it's like, oh, well, we haven't published X yet. So yes, we'd love to give it to you, but no, we can't give it to you, A, because we haven't published it, because otherwise it would be viewed as giving you something of value. So, whether it's rethinking some of, data as something that we encourage the private sector to collect, but we also enable them to return it back to the public good.
Yeah. Well, building on that, Erica Groshin has a question. She used to be the head of the BLS, and she asks, really, how important is it for companies to use common interoperable data standards in order to create the products and processes that we envision? And how do we get those kinds of standards? Maybe Pat, you could take that first.
Yeah, I've got a view on this. Like, the way I would view it is, first of all, they're not going to create common data definitions. They're not. It's never going to happen. But
then how do we compare data?
Just let me finish up. I would think of the job of the agencies on the head of the distribution as curating a notebook, right? Like I just take the simple example of revenue. Lots of companies have been defined in lots of different ways. It is not an infeasible job to curate 100 notebooks. Okay, and if you had that sort of system where the stat agency said, look, we want to make sure the thing you run every day and pump to the central server is what we want, that's a way to deal with the standardization, is to kind of have a moderated process where the agencies write down the notebook they want, companies say, we either feel or don't feel comfortable sharing that. Very much like the opt-in process we have to some of the surveys for companies currently. And that's how you do the standardization. They are never going to be standard. No way. No way.
So I think I'm maybe missing something. So how is that not a standard? If they say, okay, here's what we mean by revenue, you define it in the following way, and that's standardized. Is that not a standard?
Oh, I'm just saying, you're not going to like go to a bunch of companies and say, give me all your columns by day on this variable that you care about, and we're just going to go port those columns over. It's just is not how it looks. Everybody configures their data and their definitions in different ways based on their own operational needs.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with you, Pat. And I want to offer one, so in agreeing with you, like, for example, even what does it mean to be on a day, right? Is that the transaction day? Is that the day, so there are many different meanings of what it means to happen on, January 8th. But maybe some simple building blocks could be helpful. So take taxonomies, right? We have card swipes, and to categorize card swipes, we have merchant category codes. Well, so if you're going to use that to measure spend, that's one taxonomy. If you wanted to leverage business spend, business revenue to measure spend, for example, you would end up with a taxonomy built around NAICS codes. And yet the way we often measure these currently is through the CX, Consumer Expenditure Survey taxonomy. So can we even can we align some of these taxonomies so that you can easily move between? That feels like a low-hanging fruit, but kind of an easy building block.
That's way more complicated than you'd ever think, once you get big enough. Like, the engineering effort required, things you think should be simple can get really, really hard with this. And beyond being hard, there's a lot of mistakes that can happen. Like, there's this phrase, throwing over the wall. Like, scientists write down what they want to be done, and then you throw the white paper over the wall and the engineer codes it up. The success rate of that stuff is like 15%. I mean, it's I think companies would actually you get a lot of pushback if you told them you have to organize your data in a particular way. You know, they'd if you
But
come in
related
and-
to that, Pat, I mean, it's not just in real, there's also the issue of historical data. So if the data is kept and controlled privately, then every time a company decides to record things in a different way, you don't get a consistent data series. I mean, is there a, well, how big a problem, maybe this is for the government folks, is it if you're getting data coming in from 100 or hundreds of different companies and their definitions are changing over time, and how do we have a consistent historical and current record?
Yeah, you know, I think you already have that problem, Eric. That problem already exists. If I was asked to solve this problem, what I would do is I would be having a defect detection thing, like, okay, I've got a series from a given company, and I look at the trend and seasonality, and then boom, all of a sudden it changes. Well, I know somebody probably altered the data definition or mistake.
Well, but how do you know if it's a real change or a measurement change?
Well, that's, I would say, like, that's the job of the people who own the notebook, is then they'd see the defect, and then instead of just sending out store collectors, you have people who know how to look at the ABCs of these notebooks and then go call up their contact inside that organization and say, hey, what happened? So identifying defects of those forms, there's all sorts of technologies for doing that. It's not a difficult problem, even a pretty large scale.
Okay, Mary or Ron?
I'd say that's something we're good at statistical agencies, is we have staff who look at data and they're always asking questions. I think that was a strength we had in bringing in these new data sources in the pandemic. And we're good at coming up with strategies to clean data and make sense of it. For the Fiserv data, there's an issue of firms joining, using different companies and dropping in and out of the sample. So there was enough sample that we could build our statistics only with the firms that remained in Fiserv throughout the entire period. So, the scale is an issue, but I think we have a lot of expertise in cleaning and identifying anomalies in data.
Well, that's encouraging to hear. Ron?
Yeah, basically, Mary said essentially what I was going to say. I mean, we like Pat said, we already have this problem. So, just because we try to define something that we put on a survey form for them doesn't mean that they give us what we really needed. They give us what, the analyst that's filling out the survey form could find. And so, we have folks on our side that call companies up on a very regular basis to try to clarify issues and stuff like that. So I think that is a role that the stat agencies can play, for this sort of broader infrastructure is somehow it needs to filter through somewhere where people ask those questions and solve those issues. But it's unrealistic to think that you're gonna give a set of standards out there, I think, that everyone would adhere to.
Well, in some cases, the administrative data is there are people with a lot of power, like the IRS or SEC or others, that do define certain numbers and then that might be something that you could count on to be somewhat consistent.
And for certain variables, that is one of the tools that we use to make those comparisons, right? Because we do know that that's an auditable sense of things. But for most domains, that's not going to really be the case. It's not even going to be the case of comparing like cadastral information across one county to another, because each county does things differently.
Good point. Peter Meyer has a question, I think mostly for Mary. Revisions to GDP growth estimates after the first advanced release have sometimes been pretty large, but having more precise data like the credit card transactions could mean that the subsequent revisions are smaller. Is that right? Is that a metric that we'd see whether or not some of these kinds of data would give us better estimates?
Well, that is one of the metrics we use. And one of the things we looked at in adopting the card transaction and the modeling both before and since the pandemic. But I would say that the error has been pretty small. Now, we still have some annual updates and more data to bring in, but we've been really, we feel like we've been able to provide highly accurate statistics. And this is our work, but I mean, a lot of this comes from Census and BLS and the major data providers who've given us the source data that's very high quality throughout the pandemic. We've never had closer relationships with them, and we call those agencies when we see anomalies in the data, and that's been valuable too. So, you know, the success that we've had over time reducing our revisions is work we've done, but also work we've done in partnership with other agencies.
Possibly a little bit related to that, David Wilcox has a question about the potential for insider trading. And maybe Fiona, you're closer to Wall Street. I don't know whether people who have access to some of this real-time data before other people have access to it, is that a potential problem, especially if it becomes a basis for official statistics?
Yeah, it is a problem. And I mean, you may have noticed in the presentation that I offered today, I didn't mention specific companies of those platforms. I mentioned sectors of those. So both for, you know, privacy purposes, we're not allowed to reveal neither personal information nor client information. So that's one, but also, you know, we have to be pretty attentive to the concentration within the data to make sure that we're not getting ahead of earnings calls and things like that, of if our data series is basically representing mostly one company. So that is a pretty big concern in terms of, or barrier for us in terms of releasing, you know, sector level or more granular cuts in a much more high frequency, realer time way than what we've done so far. So it's real.
And maybe a little related to that, there's an issue of privacy, PII, et cetera. You know, the census, I work with a lot. There's a lot of efforts to try to preserve anonymity, but computer scientists are so ingenious. They have ways of figuring out and de-anonymizing data. You know, how much of it an issue is that for these kinds of ways of sharing? We start getting very fine-grained data, real-time data, that you end up revealing information that people hadn't intended to reveal. Maybe Pat.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to talk about differential privacy, but I'll say one unintended consequence of some of the privacy regulation is you may not be able to collect the data anymore. Like if you have data deletion requirements and you want to go back and look at the same series for 5, 10, 15 years, you've just lost it. And everything's got a cost and benefit. I don't know the answers to these questions. It's not what I do. But I think I remember a former commissioner of the FTC, he was pointing about, everybody talks about the costs of privacy, and yes, they are real. You know, people do want to feel like their privacy is respected, but there are benefits too. For example, this is a world very, very different than what we live in, and maybe a world you'd never want to have. If you had much less private data, you could target stimulus checks to the individual.
Mm-hmm.
Think about the amount of dead weight loss you have in taking 10, 20% of GDP and using a coarse rule of thumb to give the same thing to everybody. Like, it's just you're taking a major fraction of the output of the country and allocating it that way. And there's all sorts of unevenness there. So there are costs and benefits to these things. And I don't know the answers to these things, but I seldom hear them brought up in the public policy conversations around this stuff. And I think it's something for the agencies to think about, that you're going to go down this path at some point, because that's what the data looks.
And as with some of these other issues, it's something that the agencies have had to grapple with even before about privacy. But I think it's just amplified dramatically if you have really fine-grained, real-time data. There are folks that are very worried about privacy and want to put in legislation about that. But as you point out, Pat, then that has effects on other sides, like our ability to have historical data series. Fiona?
Yeah, just briefly, I mean, this is a precondition for us at the JP Morgan Chase Institute to use this data in this way, right? We have really formal and structured data use councils within JP Morgan. And in order for the Institute to be able to use data in ways that will then come to public light, it's all de-identified before it comes to us. And that's been from day one. Now, what I've come to realize is that de-identified is a spectrum, right, not a binary, right? And so you take something.
They don't have my name, but they have my address.
or I don't have any of that, but I have, we used to have transaction descriptions on everything, on all any checking account. But, when I buy a home and I put down a down payment and I wire money, I'm supposed to put in my name, my social security, my address, and it all lands somewhere in the transaction, or it can, right? And so now you've got trace.
Well, and then these devices are tracking everywhere we are and where we spend our time.
Right? So you end up with trace amounts of PI in things that we thought were de-identified. And so then we take those off the table and now they're behind the curtain and you have to get special access, but then we can't see everything else. So as we become, more savvy about just how easily personal identifiable information can crop up across all of our columns, it becomes actually, it's a moving target. It's a totally moving target, but I think something that has to be a precondition to this kind of use, and requires constant care and attention.
Great. So we have about 4 minutes left. So I'm just going to give each of you a chance to just a closing comment. In particular, it'd be good to hear from you about an actionable next step or something you'd like to see happen going forward. We've heard a bunch of amazing opportunities, clearly some challenges as well. Let's start turning this into action. What can we do to move the ball forward? I guess I'll go with you, Pat. We'll go in the same order that we started.
I think sensible legislation that is guided by people who actually care about measurement, that are sensitive to the issues of privacy, that are sensitive to the costs and benefits of all this stuff is really needed. That's number one. And number two, you need to start from an engineering viewpoint. You do not start these problems from a science viewpoint. You will fail if you do it. I have seen this over and over and over again as I watch teams do this. You need to have people who are experienced in setting up systems that allow you to solve many, 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 many problems with scientists as their customers. If you don't do it that way, you'll never get there.
Thanks, Pat. Mary?
I'm going to not pick one thing and say that I think we're at a point where we've got to support a lot of initiatives. We're still in the let 1,000 flowers bloom part of exploring new data sources. I like Pat's point. These are not alternative. These are new things that will be part of our portfolio. And let's find a way to continue partnering and doing new things and being willing to take chances. And I really appreciate this session. I know I learned a lot, and we'll continue down this road.
Thanks, Mary. John. Oh, sorry, Ron.
So I would agree with Pat that we do need a more thoughtful legal framework around a lot of these issues. Now, whether we can get that in the near term, I'm pretty dubious of that. I'm not sure that we're ready to even describe what exactly that would look like. But I would also say that one of the challenges that we have that we haven't really talked about today is just the notion of how you we're talking in one of society's echo chambers right here about data. We all value data. We all will, if certain people tell us the data is good, we'll believe it. But if we're going to make, big legislative changes, I think we need to be able to describe to the people outside of this echo chamber exactly what it is we're doing. And I don't think that we've done a very good job of that. And I think that, as we start to change the sort of the value chain of producing official statistical information, we're going to have to be able to describe that to people who aren't experts, and why they should trust GDP or retail sales estimates or something like that constructed from some other way, and that they don't think that there's dark arts happening here. So I think that's a piece that it is probably within the economics profession's bailiwick to start being able to be more descriptive to the public about what it is we're doing. And I think, to get to that legislation, we're going to need to be able to do that sort of thing. So thanks.
Thanks, Ron. And Fiona, you get the last word.
Well, I think the presentations today are incredibly exciting, and each one of them illustrates a moment of leadership, right? And I actually think in some ways what's required in this field is leadership, right? We receive lots of people knocking on our door say, can we share data? And often the conversation dies when it's like, well, your data needs to come with us, or our data can only go with you. And yet that's the moment in the conversation where it's like, no, forget it. Let's just do this. Let's figure out how to do it. And let's find, if we need to find a third party, which will do it for us, or, that's the moment of leadership that I think is required, because I do believe that the techniques exist to do this safely, to share, to integrate, to organize these data, and aggregate them, collect them all together. So it's more perhaps just requires leadership.
All right. Well, we've got the leaders right here on this call. We'll continue this conversation. Thank you so much. This has been amazing, and I'm really, in a way, very optimistic about the possibilities that we've heard here. There are clearly some challenges, but there's just so much potential here that I'm excited about us being able to address these things. Thank you all for sharing your insights with this. And thanks to all the audience for joining us. And that closes our session today. Thanks very much.
Thanks all.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys.